The call came in at 11:14 in the morning. I know the exact time because I was standing at the window of a waiting room on the 7th floor of Northwestern Memorial Hospital, watching a maintenance truck move slowly across the parking structure below, and I had been watching it for 40 minutes because there was nothing else to do with my hands or my eyes while my son was in surgery and the next update from the ER wasn't due for another 2 hours. My phone buzzed. I looked at the screen. Rihanna. I picked up. She didn't say hello. That was the first thing. 7 years of marriage and she didn't say hello. What she said was, "Denial, I need you to know something. I'm not coming back to the house." I stood at that window for a moment without speaking. On the parking structure below, the maintenance truck had stopped. A man in an orange vest climbed out and stood looking at something on the ground, hands on his hips, the posture of a man confronting a problem he'd been expecting. "Where are you?" I said. A pause. The kind that doesn't come from uncertainty. The kind that comes from someone who has rehearsed this conversation and is now discovering that the real version moves differently than the rehearsed one. "I'm at Sadia's." She said the name the way you say the name of a place that is supposed to explain everything. It didn't explain everything. But I already knew it explained enough. "Rihanna," I said. "Adil is in surgery right now. He went in at 9:40. I'm standing outside the ER waiting room at Northwestern. I need you to come here." Another pause. Longer this time. And then she said something I will carry for the rest of my life, not because it was cruel, exactly, but because of how precisely it drew the outline of what I had refused to see for a long time. She said, "I know. And I'm sorry that's today. But I needed to say it before I lost my nerve." I said 4 words. I said, "Come to the hospital." And I hung up. I want to tell you what happened after that. I want to tell you what those 4 words meant and what they didn't mean and what I did in the 72 hours that followed, calmly, deliberately, without performance or spectacle or the kind of noise that makes a bad situation into a catastrophe. But first I have to tell you how we got here. Because the story of how Rihanna and I arrived at that window, her at Sadia's house, me watching a parking structure at Northwestern Memorial, our son on a table I was not allowed to be near, that story has been building for longer than I admitted to myself. And understanding it is the only way any of what I did next makes any sense. My name is Denial Farouk. I'm 46 years old. I run a civil engineering consultancy out of Chicago's West Loop that I built from a 3-person office above a printing shop on Halsted Street into a firm of 29 people that has its name on the side of 3 buildings currently under construction in Illinois and 1 in Wisconsin. I spent 20 years learning how structures work. How weight distributes. How a foundation carries load. How you can look at a crack in a wall and know, before anyone else in the room knows, whether that crack is cosmetic or whether it goes all the way through to something that matters. I understand load-bearing things. I understand the difference between a structure that is functioning and a structure that is functioning but shouldn't be, the kind that looks fine from the outside and is quietly, incrementally failing from within. I apparently applied none of that understanding to my marriage. I met Rihanna at a conference in downtown Chicago 11 years ago. She was presenting a paper on urban water management systems. She had a graduate degree in environmental engineering and was working at a consulting firm in the Loop, and she had the particular quality of someone who has thought about something carefully enough that they can explain it to anyone without ever talking down to them. She stood at the front of a room of 200 people and made something technically complex feel urgent and human, and when she finished I stayed in my seat for a moment after everyone else had stood, not because I was stunned exactly, but because I recognized something in the way she thought that I hadn't encountered in a long time. I introduced myself at the coffee break. I disagreed with one of her conclusions, not aggressively, but honestly, because that's the only honest way to engage with someone who's just made a careful argument. She looked at me with the specific expression of someone running a rapid assessment and said, "Show me where you think the model breaks down." And we talked for an hour until the next session started and neither of us went to the next session. We dated for 18 months. We got married in a ceremony in Oak Park that her mother had been planning in her head since approximately the moment Rihanna turned 30. It was the kind of wedding where the speeches go long because the people giving them genuinely mean what they're saying. It was the kind of day that makes the future feel like a certainty rather than a possibility. We were happy. I want to say that clearly, because I think the story of how something falls apart can flatten the good years in ways that aren't honest. We were genuinely, substantially happy for the first 4 years. Two people who liked each other's minds and trusted each other's judgment and had built a life that felt, from the inside, like something worth having. Adil was born in our 3rd year. He arrived in the middle of February, during a snowstorm that shut down Lakeshore Drive and meant that I drove to the hospital on surface streets going 12 miles an hour while Rihanna timed her contractions in the passenger seat and calmly told me which turns to take. He was born at 3:47 in the morning and he weighed 7 pounds 4 ounces, and when the nurse placed him in my arms I understood, for the first time in my adult life, something about the weight of responsibility, not the professional kind, not the kind that comes with a contract or a deadline or a building that has to perform, but the kind that has no off switch. The kind that is simply always there from that moment forward, in everything. Adil is 8 years old now. He was diagnosed with a congenital heart condition at 4, managed for 2 years with medication and monitoring, and had been scheduled for a corrective procedure at Northwestern for 6 months. The surgery was elective in the technical sense, not immediately life-threatening, manageable without it, but the cardiologist had been clear that the window for the least invasive approach was closing, and we had made the decision together, Rihanna and I, sitting in Dr. Okafor's office on a Tuesday afternoon with Adil in the waiting room watching something on Rihanna's tablet, and the decision had been the right one, and the surgery was scheduled. And we had told Adil about it and answered his questions with the calibrated honesty you use with an 8-year-old who is too perceptive to patronize. The date was set for a Thursday in March. Rihanna called me from Sadia's house on the Thursday in March at 11:14 in the morning. I need to tell you about Sadia. Because Sadia is not the villain of this story, even though for a period of about 3 weeks I wanted her to be. Sadia Qureshi had been Rihanna's closest friend since university. They had grown up in adjacent worlds, Sadia in Karachi, Rihanna in Lahore, both in Chicago now for over a decade, and their friendship had the particular depth of people who knew each other before they knew themselves, who had been present for the becoming and not just the result. I liked Sadia. She was direct, funny, occasionally blunter than was comfortable, and loyal in the specific way of people who don't offer loyalty casually. What I didn't know, for a long time, was that Sadia had been the person Rihanna had been talking to for the 8 months before that Thursday. Not about ordinary things. About us. About the distance she felt and the things she wasn't saying and the growing sense that the life she was living had become, without either of us quite deciding it, a beautifully managed arrangement rather than an actual marriage. I didn't know this until long after the Thursday. But when I found out, I didn't fault Sadia for it. She had been doing what a good friend does, which is listening, and the listening had probably kept things from reaching a point of no return for longer than they might have otherwise. The person I learned about, and I want to be precise here, because precision matters when you're trying to understand something rather than simply react to it, was not a man from outside our life. There was no parallel relationship running alongside the official one, no other name in a caption, no secret I was the last to discover. What there was, instead, was something in some ways harder to name and in some ways more damaging. My wife had emotionally withdrawn from our marriage over a period of somewhere between 1 and 2 years, had talked about this withdrawal with her best friend for 8 months, and had arrived at a decision without ever, not once, having a direct and fully honest conversation with me about what she was feeling. I was the last to know that my marriage was ending. Not because I was being deceived, exactly. But because I had not been paying the kind of attention that would have made the gaps impossible to miss. I want to say something honest about that. About the years leading up to the Thursday. The consultancy had grown significantly between Adil's birth and that March. 3 major contracts in 18 months. A government infrastructure project that required me to be in Springfield for 3-day stretches, 7 or 8 times over the course of a year. A junior partner who turned out to need more supervision than I'd anticipated and whose supervision fell almost entirely to me. I was building something, and I told myself, in the way you tell yourself things that are partially true, that I was building it for all of us. That the work was the foundation. That a solid foundation meant everything above it was secure. What I was not doing, and what I understand now with the particular clarity that comes from having lost something to get it, was being present to the life I was ostensibly building the foundation for. I came home. I ate dinner. I asked the right questions about Adil's day, about Rihanna's projects. I showed up at the recitals and the parent-teacher meetings and the hospital appointments. I was there, consistently, in the logistical sense. I was the man who remembered the doctor's appointment time and the school event date and the name of the teacher Adil liked and the name of the one he didn't. I was competent in every way that can be tallied. I was not there in the sense that matters. I have been trying, in the months since, to put language to what that means. Because I think men of a certain generation and profession are very good at presence as provision and very poor at presence as attention. We know how to be physically in the room. We are less practiced at the thing that goes underneath that, at looking at the person across the table and asking not the functional question, how was your day, what do you need, but the real one. What are you thinking about that you haven't said? What are you afraid of? What does it feel like to be inside your life right now? Not as a check-in. As a genuine question, asked to a genuine person, with the intention of actually sitting still for the answer. I didn't ask those questions. Not because I didn't care about the answers. Because it didn't occur to me that the answers were somewhere other than where they appeared to be. Rihanna appeared fine. Our life appeared solid. The structure appeared to be holding. And I was a man who understood structures, and I should have known, better than almost anyone, that appearance and integrity are not the same thing. A wall can look perfect and be compromised at the load point. A foundation can appear stable and have a crack running through it that the next significant event will find. I should have looked more carefully. I didn't. So she carried it alone. And Sadia carried it with her. And it grew, in the way things grow when they are not addressed directly, into something that felt, from the inside of Rihanna's experience, like a decision. And she called me from Sadia's house on a Thursday morning when our son was in surgery. Come to the hospital. I hung up. I stood at the window for a while after that. The maintenance truck had moved. The man in the orange vest was gone. The parking structure below was just a parking structure, ordinary and indifferent, doing what parking structures do. A nurse appeared at the door of the waiting room and told me the surgery was going well. Dr. Okafor would come out to brief me in approximately 90 minutes. She said it the way good nurses say things, precisely, without drama, leaving room for the listener to breathe. I thanked her. She left. I sat down. I put my phone face down on the chair beside me. And I did something that I want to describe carefully, because I think it is the part of this story that most people would do differently, and I think the way you do it in those 90 minutes determines almost everything that comes after. I did not call her back. I did not call Sadia. I did not text either of them. I did not call my brother Imran, who would have driven down from Evanston inside 20 minutes with coffee and a particular expression of barely contained fury on my behalf. I did not call my parents, who would have been distressed and who would have communicated that distress in ways that would have required managing on top of managing. I did not call any of the 3 people at the firm who would have wanted to help and who would have helped by talking about it, which is the kind of help that makes the person offering it feel better and leaves the situation unchanged. I called no one. What I did was sit in a waiting room on the 7th floor of Northwestern Memorial Hospital, with my son in surgery 60 feet away, and I thought carefully about what I actually knew. I knew Rihanna had called. I knew what she had said. I knew where she was. I knew that she had said I'm not coming back to the house and not I'm done with this marriage and not I want a divorce, and I knew that the gap between those 3 phrasings was not nothing. I knew that she had said I needed to say it before I lost my nerve, which meant there was something she was afraid of and something she was forcing herself past, which meant the decision, whatever it was, did not feel to her like a relief. It felt like a reckoning. I knew that my son was in surgery and that the surgery was going well and that he was going to be in recovery before the end of the afternoon and that he was going to want to see both of his parents and that whatever happened in my marriage over the next 72 hours, I was not going to let it become something he absorbed in a recovery room while he was still coming out of anesthesia. That was what I knew. My father taught me, not in words, but in the repeated practice of watching him navigate the difficult moments of his own life, that the most important thing you can do when something significant happens is to separate what you know from what you're feeling. Not to deny what you're feeling. Never that. But to understand that feelings are not information. They are responses. And responses, particularly in the moments when they are most powerful, are the least reliable guide to what should happen next. My father is 71 years old. He spent 35 years working as a structural engineer. He has a way of standing in front of a problem that looks nothing like agitation. It looks like patience. Like the patience of someone who knows that a building will tell you what's wrong if you give it the time and attention it needs, and that rushing it, yelling at it, forcing it, none of that gets you the answer any faster. The answer comes from looking carefully and understanding what you're looking at. I sat in that waiting room and I looked carefully at what I was looking at. At 1:20 in the afternoon, Dr. Okafor came through the door. He was still in his surgical cap, which he was in the process of removing, and the expression on his face was the one I had been hoping for since 9:40 that morning, not elated, not performing any emotion, just settled. The expression of a man who has done something difficult and done it correctly and is satisfied in the specific, quiet way of competence. He sat down across from me. He told me the procedure had gone exactly as planned. The structural defect had been corrected. Adil was in recovery, coming out of anesthesia cleanly, and would be moved to a room on the pediatric ward within the hour. I could see him in approximately 45 minutes. I thanked Dr. Okafor. I meant it in a way that is difficult to put into words, the gratitude of a parent who has been sitting with the weight of an uncertain thing and has just been told the weight is lifting. He shook my hand and left. I picked up my phone. There were 11 messages from Rihanna. 3 from the first hour, spaced irregularly, the pattern of someone who sent a message and waited and then sent another when the silence became uncomfortable. Then a gap of 40 minutes. Then 4 in quick succession, shorter than the first ones. Then a final one, sent 8 minutes ago, please tell me how he is. I replied to that last one only. He's out. Procedure went well. He'll be in the pediatric ward by 2:30. Room number to follow. I put the phone in my jacket pocket. Then I called my brother. Imran picked up on the second ring, which is how Imran always picks up. He is 43 years old and runs a logistics business out of Evanston, and he has a quality I have admired since we were children, the quality of knowing when to talk and when to simply be there. I told him about the surgery first, because that was the thing that actually mattered. He exhaled the specific exhale of a man who has been holding something and is now allowed to set it down. And Rihanna? He asked. I told him. Not at length. The essential facts, plainly. He was quiet for a moment. What do you need? He said. Not what do you want to do, not what happened, not who does she think she is. What do you need? I said I needed him not to do anything. Not to call her parents, not to say anything to our parents yet. I said I needed a few days to understand the shape of it before it became something that involved anyone else's reaction, because other people's reactions to your crisis are their own crisis wearing your clothes, and I didn't have the capacity to manage both. Understood, he said. Just like that. Understood. The specific gift of a person who takes you seriously enough to follow your lead on your own life without requiring you to justify the lead. I'll be outside in an hour, he said. Don't argue. I didn't argue. I went to see my son. Adil was in a bed too large for him, which is how all hospital beds look when a child is in them. He had a nasal cannula and a monitoring lead on his finger, and his hair was flattened from the surgical cap, and he was the most awake I had ever seen someone look while simultaneously being entirely exhausted. He looked at me when I came in the door and said, "Dad, did it work?" And I said yes, it worked, and he said okay, good, and closed his eyes, and that was the most important conversation I had that entire day. Rihanna came at 3:15. I knew she would. I had not told her to, had not asked her to, had sent her the room number as a fact and nothing more. But I knew she would come because whatever she had decided about our marriage, she had not decided anything about a deal, and no decision she had made or could ever make would override that. Some things are prior to everything else. A mother coming to her child in a hospital room is prior to everything else. She came in quietly. She had changed out of whatever she'd been wearing at Sadia's and was in a gray sweater, and her hair was pulled back in the way she wears it when she is trying to hold herself together, not because it looks better that way, but because the physical act of pulling it back is itself a form of management. I know this about her. I have known it for years. The way I know that she always checks her phone screen down when she's anxious, and that she makes tea when she doesn't know what else to do with her hands, and that the pause before she says something honest is always slightly longer than the pause before she says something she's rehearsed. She looked at Adil first. She stood at the edge of his bed and looked at him in the way parents look at their children after something frightening has resolved, not with relief exactly, because relief has movement in it, and this was more like stillness. Like the return of something that had been briefly and terrifyingly absent. She touched his hand. He stirred, opened his eyes, said "Mom" in the exact tone of a child who is medicated and pleased and not interested in conversation. She smiled. She kissed his forehead. He closed his eyes again. Then she straightened and looked at me across the bed. I looked back at her. I did not say anything. Not because I didn't have things to say, I had an entire architecture of things I could have said, had been assembling it in the waiting room and in the corridor outside Adil's room, argument and counter-argument and the specific grievances of a man who has just received information he wasn't prepared for. But that room was not the room for any of it. That moment, with our son asleep between us, was not the moment for any of it. We sat on opposite sides of his bed for 2 hours. Occasionally a nurse came in. Occasionally Adil woke and asked for water or for his tablet or said something only partially coherent that made both of us almost smile. We fielded a call from Dr. Okafor's resident and a call from Rihanna's mother, which Rihanna took in the corridor, and a visit from Imran who stayed for 20 minutes and was kind and quiet and shook Rihanna's hand and said nothing with his eyes that he shouldn't have said. He is good at that, my brother. He has always been good at that. When visiting hours ended, I told Rihanna I would stay the night. She said she would also stay. We arranged it with the nursing staff, 2 chairs and a blanket, the practical logistics of 2 parents who have done this kind of parallel management before, who know how to coordinate without warmth when warmth is not available and when what is available instead is commitment to the thing in front of them. We slept in shifts. Or didn't sleep so much as exist in the space of Adil's room through the night, dozing in the chair, waking when the monitors adjusted or the nurses came for rounds. At some point in the very early morning, around 4 o'clock, I looked up and Rihanna was awake in her chair on the other side of the bed, not looking at Adil, looking at the window. The Chicago night was doing what it does in March, which is being neither winter nor spring but something uncertain and gray in between, the kind of sky that hasn't yet decided what it wants to be. She felt me looking at her. She looked back. Neither of us said anything. But something was communicated in that 4 o'clock stillness, in the particular quality of 2 people awake in the same dark room after a long and complicated day, that was more honest than anything we had managed to say to each other in a year. I don't know what she was thinking. But I know what I was thinking, that the person across the room was still my wife, still the mother of my child, still someone I had chosen and been chosen by, and that whatever had broken between us had broken in ways that were partly hers to own and partly mine to own, and that the situation in front of me was not a business problem to be solved or an adversarial position to be defended but something human and complicated and worth taking seriously rather than reacting to. Come to the hospital had not been a power move. It hadn't been a tactic or a form of manipulation or a deliberate use of our son's surgery to engineer a moment. It was the only true thing I had. Come be a mother to your son on the day he needs his mother. Whatever else you've decided, whatever else is happening between us, whatever conversation has to happen between two adults in the days ahead, come to that first. Come to the thing that is most real. She came. And in the 4 o'clock stillness of that room, with Adil's monitors making their steady sounds and the city below doing whatever it was doing without any awareness of what was happening on the 7th floor, I thought about what that meant. Adil was discharged on Saturday afternoon. He came home to the apartment on North Dearborn Street in a wheelchair that he was deeply unimpressed by, because Adil has been Adil since approximately the moment of his birth, and being wheeled out of a hospital in a chair struck him as unnecessarily ceremonial. He walked to the car on his own and I let him, staying close enough to catch him if the anesthesia residue or the still fresh incision or the simple fact of being 8 years old and recently operated on caused him to need steadying. He didn't need steadying. He got in the car and asked if we could stop for a burger. We stopped for a burger. We had not discussed, Rihanna and I, what came next. Not in the hospital and not in the car. There was an implicit agreement, unspoken but understood, that the discussion would happen after Adil was home and settled and had eaten and was in his own bed, because some conversations require a certain kind of room that a hospital room and a car with a child in the back seat were not. After he was in bed, fed, clean, monitored, kissed goodnight by both of us separately and then together, which was the first time we had been in the same small space in a way that was not organized around a medical necessity, I went to the kitchen and put the kettle on. Rihanna came in a few minutes later. She sat at the table without being invited and without needing to be. I want to tell you something, I said. Before you say whatever you're going to say. She looked at me. I said, I'm not going to fight you. I said it clearly, looking at her directly. I'm not going to make this loud, and I'm not going to make it ugly, and I'm not going to turn a deal into a geography between us. Whatever you've decided, I'm going to handle it with the same discipline I handle everything else. But I need you to know something first. She didn't speak. She was watching me with the specific attention of someone who is waiting to find out if what is coming is honest or performed. I said, I think we failed this marriage before you decided anything. I think I failed it in ways I'm still understanding. I was present in every way that's easy to count and absent in the ways that apparently matter most. I don't know when it happened or exactly how, but I know it's true. And I'm telling you that because I think you deserve honesty more than you deserve my anger, and because if this ends, whatever that ending looks like, I want us to have been honest with each other about what actually happened, not just what hurt us. She was quiet for a long time. The kettle boiled. I made 2 cups of tea. I set one in front of her. I sat down across from her. She said, I didn't call you that morning to hurt you. I know. I told myself I was being direct. That I was finally being direct instead of letting it go on. I said, you picked the worst possible moment to find your directness. She flinched. Slightly. Not elaborately, Rihanna doesn't do things elaborately. But the flinch was real. Yes, she said. I know that. Tell me what you've been feeling, I said. Not the decision. The feeling underneath it. I want to understand the actual thing, not the conclusion you reached from it. And she told me. It took a long time. The tea went cold. At some point I got up and made fresh cups and we stayed at that table until nearly 1 in the morning, which is late for 2 people who had essentially not slept in 36 hours. She talked about the distance she'd felt accumulating over years. About the way the house had become a place she managed rather than a place she lived in. About the specific loneliness of being with someone who is visibly, conscientiously, thoroughly doing the right things and not quite there, like talking to a very good recording of a person and knowing the recording is the best available version and still knowing it's not the same. She talked about her work, which she hadn't told me enough about. The consultancy she'd been building, the clients she was proud of, the project in the South Side she'd been working on for 8 months that she had mentioned to me twice and that I had acknowledged and then apparently filed and never returned to. She said that at some point she had stopped telling me things because the telling felt like dropping something into a room where nothing caught it. Not because I was hostile. Because I was absent in the specific way that busy and well-meaning people are absent, which is the most difficult kind to name because it looks so much like presence. I listened. I didn't defend myself. Not because I had no defense, I had a partial one, constructed on the realities of what the past 3 years had required of me professionally and practically. The demands were real. The Springfield trips were real. The junior partner situation was real. But a defense was not what that conversation needed. That conversation needed me to hear her. Actually hear her. To take in what she was saying and sit with it honestly instead of organizing a response while she was still talking. I heard her. And then I said the things I had been working up to in the waiting room and in the chair beside Adil's bed and in every quiet moment of the preceding 48 hours, that I understood I had not been present in the ways that mattered. That the work had been real and the demands had been real, but the consequence of how I'd handled them was also real, and I was not going to pretend it wasn't. That I didn't know if what she was feeling was something that could be addressed with enough honesty and enough genuine change, or whether it had gone past that point, but that I was willing to find out if she was. That I was not asking her to stay out of fear or obligation or for a deal, though a deal mattered. I was asking whether she wanted to find out what was actually here when we were both being honest. She said, "I don't know what I'm feeling anymore. I know I felt like I needed to get out. I know that standing in Sadia's apartment this week felt like the first time in months I could breathe properly." I said, "And now?" She looked at her hands. "Now it feels more complicated than it did from there." I said, "That's because it is more complicated. That's what happens when you come back to the actual thing instead of the idea of leaving it. Distance makes everything cleaner than it is." She looked up at me. "What are you saying?" she asked. I said, "I'm saying that I'm not asking you to stay in the version of this marriage we've been living. That version failed. I'm asking whether you want to find out what's underneath it. Under the distance and the routine and the years of good management. I think there was something real here once. I'm not certain it's still there. But I'm certain I don't want to find out it wasn't by walking away from it without having looked." A long pause. "Is that what you want?" she asked. I said, "I want to know what's actually here. That's what I want." She didn't say yes that night. I want to be precise about that, because I think the honest version of this story resists the tidy turning point. What she said was, "I need to think." And I said, "Take the time you need. But think here, not at Sadia's. I'm not asking you to perform normalcy for a deal. I'm asking you to be in the actual space of this thing while you decide what it is." She stayed. In the days that followed, I made the calls that needed to be made. I called Nadia Osei, my attorney, who has handled the firm's legal affairs for 9 years and who knows me well enough to understand the difference between a call that requires reassurance and a call that requires action. I told her what had happened. She asked the right questions in the right order: what assets were jointly held, what the firm's ownership structure was, what our residential property situation was, how our finances were organized. Not because I had decided anything about where the marriage was going. Because I had spent 20 years in business watching people make permanent decisions from temporary information, and I was not going to be the person who arrived at a crisis unprepared for any of its possible shapes. Understanding your legal position is not an act of hostility. It is an act of clarity. And clarity was what I needed more than anything else. I called my accountant separately. Same conversation, different angle. What does separation look like financially? What protections exist? What decisions, if made in haste or in feeling rather than judgment, would be difficult to undo? I made both calls in 2 hours on a Friday morning while Adil was asleep and Rihanna was in the other room. I made them quietly, from the study, with the door closed. Not because I was hiding anything. Because some decisions require thinking about before they require talking about, and I have always been the kind of person who thinks first. I also made a third call that Friday. The one that mattered most. I called Dr. Arjun Patel, a colleague who had been through a similarly serious difficulty in his marriage 4 years earlier and who had come out the other side of it in a way that struck me, every time I saw him with his family, as genuinely repaired rather than performed. He picked up and I told him in about 6 minutes what had happened. He listened without interrupting, which is a quality I have always respected in him. Then he said, "Did you call anyone yet? A counselor?" "No." "Call one." He said it simply, without drama. "Not because it'll fix it. Because you're both going to need somewhere to put the honest version of this that isn't each other's living room, and you're going to need someone trained to hold it without flinching." He gave me a name. We started seeing Dr. Maryam Khalid the following week. Dr. Khalid had a quality I hadn't expected: she was not interested in adjudicating. She was not interested in assigning cause or establishing fault or organizing the narrative into something that told a clean story with a clear villain and a clear victim. She was interested in what was actually happening between two people in a room, which is messier and less satisfying and considerably more useful than a clean story. In our first session, she asked each of us one question. Just one. She asked Rihanna, "What do you need to feel safe enough to be honest?" And she asked me, "What is the version of yourself you most want to be inside this situation?" Both questions took us longer to answer than we expected. In the third session, she asked me directly, "When did you last ask Rihanna what she was afraid of?" I thought about it properly. Not performing thought, actually searching for the answer. I said, "I don't know." She let the answer sit in the room. I said, "Longer ago than I should have." She said, "What stopped you?" I said, "I think I assumed that if something was wrong, she would tell me. I think I believed that a person who wanted to communicate something would communicate it." Dr. Khalid said, "And do you believe that now?" I said, "No. I think people who need to communicate something will communicate it when they believe it's safe to, and when they don't believe it's safe to, they carry it until they can't. And it's not always obvious what made it feel unsafe. Sometimes it's just the accumulated weight of a pattern. The pattern of not being asked. The pattern of having your responses absorbed and filed and moved past rather than sat with. The pattern of a person who is very good at managing and not as good at being present. Rihanna was looking at me from across the room. I said, "I created a pattern where she didn't feel asked." And then I was surprised when she stopped answering. That was the most important thing I said in the months of therapy. Not because it was the most dramatic or the most emotionally sophisticated. Because it was the most accurate. Because it named the actual thing rather than the symptom of it. Because I could have sat in that room and talked for weeks about what Rihanna had done, the call, the timing, the months of internal withdrawal, and all of it would have been true and none of it would have been the thing that needed saying. The thing that needed saying was, I participated in the failure of this. I did not cause all of it. But I am not standing here as someone to whom this simply happened. Over those months, I learned things about my wife that I should have known years earlier. That she had felt, in the 3rd year of our marriage, that her professional work had become secondary to mine not because either of us had said so but because the logistics of our life, who arranged childcare, who adjusted travel, who took the calls from school, whose schedule was the fixed point around which the others moved, had settled into a pattern that communicated secondary without ever using the word. She had not said anything about this because she had told herself it was temporary. The temporary extended itself quietly into permanent without either of us marking the moment. That she had been lonely in a very specific way, not the way of someone who lacks company or stimulation, but the way of someone who is surrounded by all of those things and still feels that no one in the room is fully seeing her. The specific loneliness of being known functionally and not deeply. Known as the person who manages the school calendar and knows which pediatrician to call and handles the dinner parties with professional ease. Not known as the person who had been wrestling, quietly and without saying so, with whether the life she was living still felt like hers. That she had started pulling back emotionally somewhere in the middle of Adil's first hospital year, not as a decision but as a protection. When you stop being asked what you need, you stop expecting to be asked. And when you stop expecting to be asked, you stop needing the asking. And when you stop needing the asking, you have solved the problem of loneliness in the only way that doesn't require anyone else's participation. You have become sufficient to yourself. Which looks from the outside like independence and feels from the inside like being very far away from the person sleeping beside you. I heard all of this. I sat with all of it. I did not minimize it or contextualize it or explain it away with the genuine demands the past 3 years had placed on me. The demands were real. Their consequence was also real. Both things were true simultaneously, and I was not going to use the truth of one to avoid the truth of the other. Here is what I chose not to do in those weeks and months, and I think this part of the story carries as much weight as what I did. I did not tell anyone outside the circle that needed to know. Not my partners at the firm. Not the mutual friends who would have been sympathetic in ways that would have made everything harder. Not anyone whose reaction would have required managing on top of managing everything else. The moment you make your crisis into a social fact, other people's opinions about it start to shape it. I was not going to let other people's opinions shape the most important thing I was deciding. I told Imran, because Imran was present and contained and trusted. I told Arjun, because he had been through it and his advice was sound. I told Nadia only what she needed to know to advise me legally. No one else. I did not use Adil as a measure of Rehana's choices. Not once, in any conversation, did I suggest that the decision she was working through had a consequence for him that she needed to weigh. Children are not leverage. They are not proof of anything. They are not the reason two people who have stopped being honest with each other should perform a marriage they've outgrown. If Rehana and I were going to find a way forward, it was going to be because we chose each other, not because we were both too afraid to disrupt Adil's life. A child raised inside a house full of managed distance learns that managed distance is what love looks like. I was not going to teach him that. I did not go looking for a worst-case version of the situation. There were days when the simplest and most human thing would have been to look at her phone or her email or her calendar and confirm whether there was something she hadn't told me. I made a deliberate decision not to do that. Because I understood, clearly, that if I needed to investigate my wife in order to trust her, the investigation had already answered the question. The question I was trying to answer was not whether there was something she was hiding. The question was whether there was something worth rebuilding. And that question could not be answered by surveillance. It could only be answered by attention. I paid attention. There was a night, about 6 weeks after Adil came home from the hospital, when I was in the study and Rehana appeared in the doorway in a way that had become, over the years, a signal. The doorway was where she arrived when she had something she hadn't yet decided how to say. I put down what I was working on. She came in and sat in the chair across from my desk and was quiet for a moment. She said, "I talked to Sadia today." I said, "Okay." She said, "I told her I wasn't coming back there. That I needed to figure out what was actually here before I decided anything was actually gone." I held that. She said, "I know that doesn't fix anything. I know it's not a decision. I know there's a long distance between telling Sadia that and actually knowing what I want. But I needed you to know I said it." I said, "Thank you for telling me." That was it. That was the whole conversation. No celebration, no relief, no declaration of arrival at some new and better place. Two people sitting in a study at 11 o'clock at night, doing the quiet and undramatic work of trying to find their way back to something that had been allowed to drift far enough that finding it required effort. There were harder nights than that one. There was a Tuesday in April when Rehana said something that landed with the precision of an accurate observation made by someone who has been watching carefully enough to see what is true. She said that for years she had felt like the life we were living had been designed for someone who was almost her. Like the specifications had been drawn up by someone who loved her carefully but had not checked in a long time whether the specifications were still accurate. I sat with that for a long time. I said, That's the most accurate thing anyone has ever said about what went wrong. She looked at me. She hadn't expected me to receive it that way. I said, I designed a life for the version of you I understood and stopped updating the drawing. And I called that stability. I called it providing. I called it knowing what you needed. She said, quietly, yes. I said, I'm updating the drawing. She almost smiled. Not quite. But something shifted in her expression that was more real than a smile, the specific shift of someone who has said a difficult thing and found that it landed honestly rather than defensively. In the fourth session, Dr. Khalid asked Rihanna a question that I want to tell you about because the answer changed something in me that I am still working to name. She asked, what would it have looked like, if the marriage had been working? Not ideally. Just, what would the ordinary version of a good version of this have felt like? Rihanna thought about it for a long time. Then she said, like being in a room with someone who was glad I was there. Not grateful. Not impressed. Just glad. The way you're glad when the person you most want to talk to calls at exactly the right moment. The room was quiet. I thought about how long it had been since Rihanna had felt that from me. I thought about how easy it is to be grateful for a person and how different that is from being glad of them. Gratitude is about what someone has done. Gladness is about who they are. I had been grateful for Rihanna, for how she managed things, for how she handled Adil's illness with a steadiness that covered the fear underneath, for how she navigated the social terrain of my professional life without complaint, for all the visible and countable ways she made things work. But gladness, the simple, bottomless, daily gladness of someone whose presence makes the room better, I had let that go quiet somewhere in the years of managing and building and providing, and I had not noticed it going quiet because I had convinced myself that the gratitude was the same thing. It is not the same thing. That is the lesson. That is the thing I would say to anyone listening who is sitting in a long and solid-seeming marriage and reading this and thinking it doesn't apply to them. Gratitude and gladness are not the same thing. Provision and presence are not the same thing. Competence and love are not the same thing. You can have all of the first things and none of the second things and call it a marriage and be entirely wrong about what you have. Adil came to my study about 2 months after his surgery. He stood in the doorway in the manner of someone who has been thinking about something and has decided to address it directly, which is Adil's manner in most situations. He is 8 years old and he has a quality I recognize from watching myself and watching my father, the quality of waiting until you're ready before you speak, rather than speaking while you're still figuring out what you mean. He said, "Dad, are you and Mum fighting?" I said, "No. We're talking about some things that are complicated." He said, "Is it about me?" I said, "No. It's about us. Grown-up stuff. It doesn't have anything to do with you." He considered this. He gave it the specific seriousness he gives to things he's decided are worth taking seriously. Then he said, "Are you going to fix it?" I said, "We're working on it." That's the honest answer. He thought about that for a moment. He said, "Okay." Then he turned around and went back to whatever he had been doing, because Adil moves through the world with a confidence and information that I find both admirable and humbling. He asked. He received an honest answer. He processed it. He moved on. There was no performance, no lingering, no extraction of additional reassurance. He had asked the thing he needed to ask and gotten the truth, and that was sufficient. I sat at my desk after he left and thought about the word okay. About what it contained. About the trust inside it, the trust of a child who has decided the adults in his world are being honest with him about the important things, and who is therefore equipped to handle everything that falls below the threshold of the important things, which is most of life. Children know more than you think they know. They read the atmosphere with an accuracy that adults underestimate, because adults have learned to perform past their readings. Adil had been reading our atmosphere for months. He knew something was happening. What he needed to know was not the details of it, those were not his to carry, but that the important thing was being handled honestly by the people he trusted to handle it. "We're working on it," told him that. And he accepted it. I don't take that lightly. He trusted me with that okay. He trusted both of us with it. And maintaining the conditions that made that trust possible, keeping the atmosphere clear enough that the most he had to absorb was we're working on it rather than the full weight of what was actually happening, that was the work underneath the work. The thing that required the most consistent discipline. 8 months after that Thursday in March, I am going to tell you where things are. They are not resolved, in the sense of having arrived at a place where nothing remains uncertain. I want to be precise about that because I think the honest version of this story resists the ending that makes it feel like a completed project. We are not the same as we were, which is both accurate and appropriate. The marriage we had before was not the marriage either of us wants to be inside for the next 30 years. We are building something that has the same names and addresses as the previous version and a substantially different structure. Rihanna and I eat dinner together most evenings. Not performatively. Actually. We talk during those dinners about things that are not logistics, not schedules, not ideals, needs and appointments. We talk about what we're thinking. What we're afraid of. What we noticed during the day that we want to share with someone because the sharing is the point of noticing it. We ask the questions we stopped asking and receive the answers we stopped expecting. It is not romantic in the way the early years were romantic. It is something more difficult and more honest than that. It is two people who know what they are capable of, both the good and the damaging, choosing deliberately to do something different with what they know. 3 weeks ago, Rihanna and I drove out to the site of a project in the western suburbs. A community center, early stages, the kind of building that will serve the same families for 40 years if it's done right. She hadn't come out to a site with me in years, and she asked if she could come on a Saturday morning, and I said yes, and we drove out and I showed her what it was going to be. She asked good questions. The questions of someone who is genuinely looking at the thing rather than performing interest in it. At one point she stood at the edge of what would become the main entrance and looked at the structural frame and said, "It's going to be beautiful." I said, "I hope so. The structure has to be right first. Beautiful only works if what's underneath it can carry the load." She looked at me sideways. A small look, but I caught it. She said, "You and your structures." I said, "It matters." She said, "I know it does." We drove home through the kind of late winter morning that can't decide what season it is. The light was doing something uncertain and generous at the same time, the way March light sometimes does in Chicago, coming in at an angle that makes ordinary things look briefly like something worth photographing. We were quiet for a while, comfortable in the way that takes years to build and can be lost quickly and has to be rebuilt brick by brick, conversation by conversation, question by question, until one day you notice it is there again, not the same as it was, but present. Real. Yours. I want to tell you about the 4 words one more time. Because I have thought about them more than anything else in the past 8 months, and I think what I understand about them now is different from what I understood in the moment I said them. Come to the hospital was not clever. It was not calculated. It was not a technique for managing an emotionally difficult situation to a particular outcome. It was the simplest possible statement of the only priority that was actually clear in a moment when nothing else was clear. Our son was in surgery. He needed his mother. Whatever else was true, that was true. And I said it. That's all it was. But here is what I understand now that I didn't fully understand then. The 4 words worked not because of what they were, but because of what came after them. The 90 minutes in the waiting room. The decision to call Imran and no one else. The room number sent without conditions. The 2 hours sitting on opposite sides of Adil's bed without making it into anything more than what it needed to be. The kitchen table at midnight with cold tea and honest conversation. The call to Nadia. The call to Arjun. The sessions with Dr. Khalid. The hundreds of small moments in which I chose, again and again, to be the version of myself I wanted to be inside a difficult thing rather than the version the difficulty was trying to pull out of me. The 4 words were the beginning. The work was what came after. My father told me once, when I was in my 20s and facing something professionally difficult and handling it badly, that the most important thing a person can learn is the difference between reacting and deciding. Reacting is what happens when the feeling leads. Deciding is what happens when the feeling is present but the judgment leads. He said, you can feel everything and still decide. The feeling doesn't have to drive. It just has to be acknowledged. I have thought about that in the 8 months since March. About what it means to feel everything, the shock of the phone call, the grief of the hospital room, the specific anger of a man who has just found out that the person he was building something with has been somewhere else in her mind for a year, and to let all of that be true and real and present without letting any of it make the decision. I felt all of it. Every bit of it. In the waiting room and in Adil's hospital room and in the kitchen at midnight and in the quiet of my study at 4 a.m. when the rest of the house was asleep and there was no one to perform anything for. I felt it in the specific way that loss feels when it arrives as information before it arrives as reality. You know it with your mind before your body catches up, and there's a window of time in between where you are somehow holding both the knowledge and the not yet feeling simultaneously, and that window is the most important window you have, because what you do inside it determines almost everything. I used that window to think rather than react. That is the only thing I did well in the immediate aftermath. That is the thing I would say to anyone who finds themselves standing at a similar window, the feeling will arrive. All of it, with full force. Let it. But in the window before it does, think. Think about what you know. Think about what you don't know yet. Think about what the best version of yourself would do inside this, and then do that, even if, especially if, it is the harder thing. My name is Daniel Farouk. I'm 46 years old. I run a civil engineering consultancy in Chicago that I built with my own hands and my own judgment and a specific refusal to cut corners on anything structural, because I have always believed that what holds something up matters more than how it looks from the street. 8 months ago, my wife called me from her best friend's apartment on the morning our son was in surgery and told me she wasn't coming home. I said 4 words. I hung up. And then I sat in a waiting room and thought carefully, as carefully as I have ever thought about anything, about what I actually knew and what I needed to do with it. What I found, when I looked carefully, was that the structure had been compromised for longer than the crisis had been visible. That both of us had participated in the compromising. That the crack that had finally shown itself on a Thursday morning in March had been there, quietly, for years, the accumulated consequence of 2 people who were both doing everything right and somehow not doing the thing that mattered. I found that. I named it. I did not turn it into a reason to walk away from the building. I turned it into a reason to understand the structure better and build it differently. We are building it differently. Every day, in the quiet and unspectacular and entirely necessary ways that real repair actually looks like. Not the dramatic renovation. The daily maintenance. The regular, painstaking, unglamorous work of 2 people choosing honesty when silence is available, asking the question when assumption is easier, being present when being occupied is more comfortable. A sound structure is not just well designed. It is inhabited with intention. It is looked after. The cracks, when they appear, and they always appear, in any structure, given enough time and enough weight, the cracks are found and addressed before they go all the way through. That is the work. Not the grand gesture. Not the turning point. The work is the everyday of it. We are doing that work. If something in this story found you, if you have ever sat in a difficult moment and had to decide which version of yourself you were going to be inside it, leave a comment below. Tell me what you decided. And if these are the kinds of stories you want to keep reading, the real ones, the complicated ones, the ones that do not end cleanly because real ones never do, subscribe. We are just getting started here. There is something I have not yet told you about the weeks after Adil came home. The weeks that don't make it into the version of this story that has a shape to it, the weeks that are just texture, just the ordinary difficult days of 2 people trying to find their way back to each other through the accumulated scar tissue of years of not quite paying enough attention. There was a Sunday morning, about 3 weeks after Adil came home from the hospital, when I came down to the kitchen and found Rihanna sitting at the table with a cup of tea she hadn't drunk and a document open on her laptop that she closed when I came in. Not quickly, not guiltily, there was nothing to hide in it. I found out later it was a report for a client she was overdue on, but with the specific reflex of someone who has grown accustomed to keeping parts of their life separate. She closed the laptop and looked up and said good morning, and I said good morning, and I poured coffee, and we sat at the same table in a silence that was neither comfortable nor hostile. Just two people in a room, learning again how to be in the same room. I said, "What were you working on?" She looked at me. The question surprised her. Not because it was intrusive, but because I didn't usually ask. I had made a habit, over years, of respecting what I took to be her preference for compartmentalization. I gave her space. I gave her space so consistently and with such thoroughness that I had effectively given her the experience of being alone in a marriage. She said, "The Evanston Drainage Project. I'm 3 weeks behind." I said, "Tell me about it." She looked at me for a moment longer than was necessary, assessing whether the question was what it appeared to be or whether it was something else, a form of management, a therapeutic technique, something I had picked up from Dr. Khalid and was now deploying with intention. I understood the look. I had given her years of reasons to look for the gap between what I said and what I meant. It was what it appeared to be. I wanted to know what she was working on. I wanted to hear her talk about something she cared about. She told me about the project. It was an infrastructure remediation in Evanston, stormwater management, the kind of work that sits at the intersection of engineering and urban planning and requires both technical precision and the ability to negotiate with municipal stakeholders who have competing priorities and limited patience. She talked about it with the fluency of someone describing something they understand thoroughly, and as she talked I noticed the specific quality of her when she is inside something that interests her, the way her hands move slightly when she's explaining something spatially, the way her voice changes register when she moves from describing the politics to describing the technical solution. I had not asked her about her work in a long time. I had asked, in the way you ask, "How is the project going, any news from the client?" but I had not asked in the way that she was talking to me now. I had not asked in the way that invited the whole thing, not just the summary. We talked for an hour. Not about us. Not about the sessions with Dr. Khalid or the state of the marriage or what either of us was working through. About her project. About a drainage problem in Evanston that she had an elegant solution to and that the city council was skeptical of and that she was going to have to make one more presentation to defend. When she finished, she looked at me with an expression I recognized from the early years. The expression of someone who has been heard and is slightly surprised by it, because being heard fully is rarer than it should be and we register its presence the same way we register warmth on a cold day, not with elaborate gratitude, but with a kind of involuntary settling. She said, "You used to ask me things like that. In the beginning." I said, "I know." She said, "What happened?" I thought about it honestly. Not the defensive version of the answer, not the version that cited the work and the demands and the years. The honest version. I said, "I think I started assuming I knew. I thought I understood how you thought and what you were working on and what mattered to you, and I stopped checking whether what I understood was still accurate. I treated the knowledge I had of you as fixed when it was always changing, because you were always changing, because people always are. And I never noticed the gap between the version of you I was carrying in my head and the actual version of you in the room." She was quiet. I said, "That's what I mean when I say I stopped asking. Not that I stopped caring. That I stopped checking." She said, very quietly, "That's the most useful thing anyone has said to me about this in months. Including Dr. Khalid." I said, "Dr. Khalid is still more useful. She asks the questions I can't ask myself." Rihanna almost smiled. She was getting better at almost smiling. I was learning to notice the almost as its own thing, not to measure it against the full smile and find it lacking. In the 5th session with Dr. Khalid, something happened that I have thought about every day since. We were in the middle of a conversation that had become difficult, the specific difficulty of two people circling the truth of something that neither of them quite wants to say out loud because saying it out loud makes it a fact rather than a feeling. Rihanna had been talking about the period before she started talking to Sadia. The period before she had even named to herself what she was feeling, which she described as a kind of low-grade wrongness, like hearing a frequency you can't identify and can't locate and can't make stop. Dr. Khalid asked her, "Did you want Daniel to notice?" Rihanna stopped. The question landed in a particular way. After a while, she said, "I think I wanted him to notice without my having to ask him to notice. I think I needed that to be something he did because he was paying attention, not something he did because I told him to." Dr. Khalid said, "And if he had noticed?" Rihanna said, "I think I would have believed it was real. That the attention was real. I sat with that in my chair. I sat with it for a long time. Then I said, I didn't notice. Not because I wasn't watching. Because I was watching for the wrong things. I was watching for the things that needed solving. Problems I could fix. I was not watching for the things that just needed to be seen." Dr. Khalid said nothing. She didn't need to. Rihanna looked at me. I looked at her. And in that room, with the third person present who was trained to hold difficult things without flinching, we had the most honest 3 seconds of our marriage. Not a conversation. Not a declaration. Just two people understanding simultaneously, for the first time in the same moment, what had actually happened between them. I want to tell you about a different call I made, one I haven't mentioned yet, that I made about 3 weeks after the Thursday. I called my father. My father, Ashraf Farouk, is 71 years old. He worked for 35 years as a structural engineer before he retired. He lives now in a house in Oak Park that he and my mother have owned since 1987 and that he has maintained with the same meticulous attention he gave to every structure he ever worked on. He is a man who has always conveyed more through what he does than through what he says, which is a quality I recognized in myself very early and have spent years either imitating or compensating for, depending on the situation. He picked up on the second ring. I told him what had happened. Plainly, with the same precision I use when I need to convey something important without letting emotion do the structural work the facts need to do. I told him about the call, the 4 words, the hospital, the Saturday discharge, the kitchen table at midnight. I told him where things stood 3 weeks out. Still uncertain. Still working. He was quiet for a long time. My father's silences are not empty. They are the silences of a man who is thinking carefully about what he wants to say, because he has learned that imprecise words in difficult situations can do structural damage that takes years to repair. Then he said, "You didn't lose your nerve." Not a question. An observation. I said, "I wanted to." Several times. He said, "That's different from losing it." He paused. Then he said, "When did you realize something was wrong?" Not this, before this. When did you first notice? I thought about it honestly. Not the version I would have told someone who might judge the answer. The actual answer. I said, about 8 months ago. I noticed she was quieter. More contained. I noticed she had stopped bringing me things. Ideas, observations, the small daily currency of a person who is actually talking to you. She was still talking. Just not bringing me things. He said, "And?" I said, "And I told myself she was tired. I told myself Adil's medical situation was weighing on her. I told myself the work was intensive. I told myself all the things that were true and convenient simultaneously." He said, "Did you say anything to her?" I said, "No." He was quiet again. Then he said, "You know what you should have done." I said, "Yes." He said, "You know it would have been uncomfortable." I said, "Yes." He said, "And you're telling me you said nothing because of a combination of not wanting to make it uncomfortable and genuinely not believing it was as serious as it was?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Then you need to learn the difference between those two things." Discomfort you avoid because it's hard, and discomfort you avoid because you've assessed the situation and decided it doesn't require address yet. Those are completely different decisions. One of them requires courage. One of them is avoidance dressed as judgment. He let that sit. Then he said, "What are you going to do differently?" Not, "What are you doing?" Not, "What happened to cause this?" What are you going to do differently? Past the crisis and into the actual question. I said, ask the uncomfortable question instead of letting the comfortable assumption carry it. He said, say it like you mean it. I said, I'm going to ask her what she's feeling, and then I'm going to sit still for the answer even when the answer is hard. I'm going to stop watching for the things I can solve and start watching for the things that just need to be seen. He said, that'll do. That was the whole conversation. 22 minutes. My father doesn't believe in length for its own sake. He said what needed to be said and heard what he needed to hear and considered the matter addressed. I drove home from that call differently than I had driven anywhere in a while. Not because anything had changed in the outside world. Because something had been named that I had been carrying without naming, and named things have a different weight than unnamed ones. Named things you can work with. Unnamed things just press on you from a direction you can't locate. I have been asked, in the months since, by people who know the outline of this story, whether I think what happened was fair. Whether I think Rihanna was right to handle it the way she did. Whether the call on the Thursday morning constituted a kind of cruelty, regardless of the accumulated circumstances that preceded it. It's a fair question. I've sat with it. Here is what I actually believe. The call was wrong in its timing. That is unambiguous, and she knows it, and she has said so, in the sessions and outside them, with the specific kind of ownership that is not performed remorse but genuine reckoning. The Thursday morning was the wrong moment, chosen not entirely consciously but not entirely unconsciously either, chosen because she had worked up the nerve and was afraid that if she didn't use it immediately she would lose it again. That is human, and it is also a form of prioritizing her own preparation over the reality she was calling into. There is a cost to that choice. She carries it. But the decision itself, the decision to name that something was wrong, to say I am not okay in this marriage, to stop maintaining a form that had lost its substance, that decision was not wrong. That decision was, in fact, the decision she should have made earlier and with me rather than instead of me. If she had come to me 8 months before the Thursday and said, I am losing myself in this marriage, I feel invisible, I am carrying something I don't know how to put down, if she had said that, I would have had the chance to respond. To be the person I could have been. The decision to leave was preceded by a failure to try, and the failure to try was partly hers and partly mine. I participated in the conditions that made leaving feel easier than saying. That is the part of this that I have had to sit with and that I do not get to assign to her. Both things are true. Both things are being worked on. That is what honest repair looks like. My name is Daniel Farouk. I'm 46 years old. I run a civil engineering consultancy in Chicago that I built with my own hands and my own judgment and the specific and non-negotiable refusal to cut corners on anything structural, because I have always believed, more than I believe almost anything else professionally, that what holds something up matters more than how it looks from the street. 8 months ago, my wife called me from her best friend's apartment on the morning our son was in surgery and told me she wasn't coming home. I said 4 words. I hung up. And then I sat in a waiting room and thought carefully, as carefully as I have ever thought about anything, about what I actually knew and what I needed to do with it. What I found, when I looked carefully, was that the structure had been compromised for longer than the crisis had been visible. That both of us had participated in the compromising. That the crack that had finally shown itself on a Thursday morning in March had been there, quietly, for years, the accumulated consequence of 2 people who were both doing everything right in every way that is easy to measure, and somehow not doing the thing that actually holds a life together. Presence. Not provision. Presence. Gladness. Not gratitude. Gladness. The question underneath the question. Not how was your day, but what are you afraid of? Not I'm here, but I see you. Not the performance of a good husband, but the actual practice of it, the daily, unglamorous, sometimes inconvenient practice of looking at the person you chose and asking yourself honestly whether she knows you're glad she's there. I understand structures. I understand foundations. I understand that what holds something up is more important than what faces the street. And I understand, now, with the particular clarity that costs something to arrive at, that a foundation built on managed distance and assumed understanding and the comfortable illusion of knowing someone because you once knew them, that is not a foundation. That is a form. And forms fail when the load gets heavy enough to find what's actually there. We are laying a different foundation. Brick by brick. Conversation by conversation. Question asked instead of assumed. Silence offered instead of filled. Presence offered instead of provision. It is the work. It is quiet and unspectacular, and it is the only work that matters. We are doing it. If something in this story found you, if you have ever realized, too late and then possibly not too late, that you were somewhere other than where the person you love needed you to be, leave a comment below. Tell me what you did with that. And if the kind of stories that don't end cleanly because real ones never do are the stories you want more of, subscribe. We are just getting started here.